God morgon allihopa. Välkommen till detta webbinar tillsammans med oss på WithSecure. För er som inte har snappat upp det än i alla fall så har ju bolaget F-Secure gjort en split. Så vi som ni är på webbinariet tillsammans med, vi är WithSecure nu och vi fokuserar enbart på B2B, alltså göra cybersäkerhet för företag. F-Secure de kommer fortsätta under namnet F-Secure men bara fokusera på hemanvändare och konsumenter. Det är fortfarande lite folk som håller på och droppar in, så vi kommer ge det här lite tag innan vi börjar igång, så att nu är det ett utmärkt tillfälle att gå och hämta den här kopp kaffen för er som glömde det. Men med oss idag så har jag min kära kollega, eller mina två kära kollegor, Isabelle Lindgren som jobbar med mig här i Sverige på marknad. And now I'm going to switch over to English directly. So we also have Mikko Hyppönen with us. And of course, Mikko, almost everybody knows who you are. But for those who don't know who you are, can you please just introduce yourself and what do you do at WithSecure?
God morgon, det är en finne igen. Indeed, my name is Mikko and I've been working with this company for 31 years under different names, because funnily enough, when I joined the company, it wasn't WithSecure, it wasn't even F-Secure, it wasn't even Data Fellows. The company has renamed itself multiple times. The first version of this company that I started working for in June 1991, I got my payslip from a company called Data, which was a daughter company for Data Fellows, which renamed itself to F-Secure. And now in 2022, we're splitting into two different companies. So the role I play in the company today is the Chief Research Officer, and my main task is to build an understanding of the enemy. So I spend my time investigating global crime gangs and nation states, intelligence agencies and militaries. Over the last 2 months, I've spent practically all my time watching the Ukraine situation.
Awesome. And I thought that maybe we should start there a little bit with what goes on in Ukraine and of course cybersecurity and, for instance, maybe cyber weapons has been obviously very high up on in the headlines and the agenda. But just to give some clarity here in the beginning, if you can help the audience with that, what is a cyber weapon and what is not a cyber weapon?
When we look at the various kinds of cyber attacks we see, or computer security attacks we see, we have to look at the attackers. Like, who are these people? Why do they do what they do? And this has evolved a lot. When I look back to the early days of the industry, we were just fighting hobbyists or happy hackers writing viruses for fun or breaking into services for fun. And clearly that time is way behind us now. Now, today, the vast majority of the attacks we see are coming from organized cybercrime gangs. In fact, we estimate that 98% of the samples we analyze at WithSecure are coming from organized crime gangs, and they have nothing to do with cyber weapons. We use the term cyber weapons for governmental attacks. When governments use offensive cyber power, that's the typical term we use for that. Now, cyber weapons don't equal cyber war. For example, maybe the most famous cyber weapon in history, which was Stuxnet from the year 2010, was a great example of a cyber weapon, but it was not an example of cyber war. You see, Stuxnet was written by the governments of United States and Israel, and they were targeting the government of Iran. And these countries were not at war with each other when this attack was launched. So in that case, we speak about cyber sabotage. It was cyber sabotage done by governments using a cyber weapon. However, exactly the same scenario, exactly the same attack would have been cyber war if there would have been a state of war between these countries. So when we fast forward to where we are today, what's happening right now in Ukraine, even though Russia doesn't call it a war, everyone else does. Clearly, this is a war, and when governments are using offensive cyber power against each other during a war, that's cyber war. So what's happening right now is in Ukraine is cyber weapons being used to wage war, cyber war.
And then we have cyber terrorism, right? What's the difference?
When cyber weapons are being used by terror groups, then that's cyber terrorism. And that's something we haven't seen very good examples of, which is great. I actually did my first study in cyber terrorism around 11, 12 years ago. I spoke about this at the RSA conference around that time. And I tried to come up with examples of cyber terrorism. The only examples, and there were plenty of examples of terrorist groups using the internet to radicalize people, to recruit people, to spread propaganda. That all happens, but that's still different from actually doing attacks. And in 2022, we still haven't seen a concrete example of extremist or terrorist groups using cyber attacks or cyber weapons to do terror attacks, which is a bit surprising. It would be fairly easy, for example, to do a combined attack, let's say a real world bomb strike, and to make it worse by doing a cyber attack at the same time, which, for example, would shut down first responders systems or disable 112 or things like that. We haven't seen even that, which is great, but it's likely that eventually we will.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, I see that we have some questions and people commenting already. And on your, I think it's right side, you have a little bubble with a question mark in it. And that's where you can ask questions. And we'll pass over all the questions to Mikko, so he'll answer them all, and we'll try to answer all the questions. So if there's anything you want to ask, this is the time, and put your question in there. But I have a question for you, Mikko. So Russia and China are more often, maybe than other countries, seen in headlines regarding cyber attacks. Why those countries? What makes them different?
If I would have to rank countries by their cyber capability, like who has the best offensive capability in the world, Russia and China would not be number one. In fact, I discussed this very topic at length in my upcoming book. I have a book coming out in August in English, which is going to be called "If It's Smart, It's Vulnerable," and it has a whole section on Russia and China and offensive cyber power they are waging. For those of you who read Finnish, you can read the book already. It's available in Finnish, but for those of you who don't, you have to wait until August. With any luck, it even will get translated to Swedish. We'll see. Now, if I would have to name the best country in the world to have offensive cyber capability, the answer is very easy. It is United States. No other country has invested more money for longer periods of time for both governmental defense and governmental offense systems than United States. Number two in my book would be Israel. They, as a very close ally to USA, have been building tons of offensive capability, and they have the track record to show it. We already mentioned Stuxnet. Another great example on the offensive cyber power of Israel is the intelligence attacks they've done, with maybe the most amazing example being that they infiltrated the internal network of the security company Kaspersky and stayed there for multiple months without getting detected. And that's a remarkable achievement because it's one of the best, technologically one of the best security companies in the world. So what then explains Russia and China always making the headlines whenever we read about governmental cyber attacks? And the answer is Russia and China don't really care about getting caught. The West, when the West uses offensive cyber power, the last thing they want to do is to get caught, because it's embarrassing and we're not supposed to do that. Russia and China know that nothing's going to happen. If they get caught, that's it. I mean, they got caught, which doesn't matter to them at all. These cyber weapons are affordable, effective, and deniable. They can keep denying that, no, it wasn't us, it was just some hacker group from somewhere. And even if they get caught red-handed, which has happened, they know that sanctions or reactions they get from that will be much less severe than from what they get from equivalent real-world attacks. So they are in the headlines because they don't care about getting caught.
And we have Nicholas here asking about, what about North Korea?
Yep. Then when we look at these countries, the 4 countries we named so far, and go down the list, then we end up with countries like Iran and North Korea. But the interesting question is, how will the list continue? The obvious ones, the big players, okay, let's say the Five Eyes, that's USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and United Kingdom, clearly have great offensive capability. The ones we mentioned, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, yeah, sure. Then when we get beyond that list, we end up in what I call the fog of the cyber war. What I mean by this is that the power of traditional weapons is typically in deterrence. In this context, that means that if you have powerful weapons, you don't have to use your weapons, you just have to show them. This is the reason why we do military parades. This is the reason why we do or used to do nuclear testing. This is the reason why you can go to Wikipedia and get a full listing of exactly how many fighter jets Sweden has, or Norway has, or Germany has, or Vietnam has, or Japan has. This is all public information. The idea is that if you have powerful enough army, you never have to use it. You just need to show it. Now, this doesn't apply to cyber. We know the biggest players, but when we get down the list, what's the offensive cyber capability of Sweden, of Norway, of Germany, of Vietnam? The fact is we have no clue. We have no idea, and there will never be a military parade showing the offensive cyber capability. How would you even show it? The only way you could show it is to bring your enemies in and practically show how you're able to use exploits to break into computer systems used for military control, for example. And you can't do that because unlike any other weapons, if you show your enemy how your cyber exploits work, they can do the same. If you show how this weapon works, they can build the same weapon. If you show a fighter jet or a tank, they can't steal it. If you show an exploit, they can, which means we will never be able to show them, which means we will never get the deterrence power from cyber weapons. And this is why there's the fog of the cyber war. We have no clue of what is the offensive capability of different countries.
Mikko, what is like the real expense behind developing these cyber weapons, and what are the costs behind it? Like if we in the Nordics should ramp up our offensive capabilities, like what is needed to be invested in?
And for the record, we in the Nordics should ramp up our offensive capability. The capability to attack is part of the credible defense. The reason why we train our traditional military to shoot with tanks or cannons or use cruise missiles, it's not that we would like to use them. You just have to have the capability so you have credible defense, so nobody comes trying. And exactly the same thing applies to all kinds of defense, including cyber defense. Now, I did say that cyber weapons are effective, affordable, and deniable. And yes, affordable here means that cyber weapons are cheaper than real world equivalents. If you want to shut down a weapons factory, you either send a bombing run with bomber jets or cruise missiles, or you launch a cyber attack to disable it remotely. And cyber attacks are cheaper than traditional bombing runs or cruise missiles, but they are not free. This requires manpower, research and capability, acquiring exploits, maintaining technical capability for longer periods of time. So building a weapon like Stuxnet costs millions and millions, maybe 10 million, 20 million range. That's an educated guess, but that's still cheaper than running a B-52 fleet to do a bombing run from Nevada to Iran, which is what they should have been doing otherwise to delay Iranian nuclear enrichment as much as they did with Stuxnet.
And if you take an example here, that during Corona, for instance, I know that there were a couple of incidents that, for instance, touched you a lot, and you plead, for instance, on Twitter that the hackers, they should stay away from the hospital. Some did, some didn't. Is there any ethical line when it comes to a cyber war, which we will not cross or which we shouldn't cross?
Yeah, you're right. I did send an open letter to cybercrime gangs in the beginning of Corona, telling them to stay away from hospitals. I wasn't really expecting a reply, but I did get a reply from many of these. Multiple gangs actually put out notes on their website saying that they would stay away from hospitals. Then again, other gangs did exactly the opposite and say that they would be targeting hospitals even more because now they know that they would pay. So some criminals have ethics, other criminals don't. It's a gray line on where it actually goes. And in particular, when we speak about the rules of law for war, this is something that we have to define for cyber war. For traditional warfare, we have a set of guidelines. Like during war, you're not supposed to bomb hospitals, you're not supposed to bomb churches, you're not supposed to kill civilians, you're not supposed to use chemical weapons, things like that. We have rules, we don't always follow them, but we do have rules. And we don't have rules yet for cyber war, but we will. This is something that we definitely will have, we just don't have them yet. And there is work being done on this. In fact, the cyber CCDCOE, Center of Excellence for NATO Center of Excellence in Tallinn, has done great research on this very topic. Nothing official has been set in stone yet, but the kind of rules we will have, I believe, will include things like automatically disabling your cyber weapons after certain amount of time has passed from the attack, which would be the equivalent of having your landmines automatically disabled after 2 years they've been dug into ground, which means after the war is over, the mines would no longer kill civilians in the area. You could do the same thing with cyber weapons. Interestingly enough, Stuxnet 2010 already had this built in. Stuxnet had an internal kill date. It stopped all operations on the 1st of June in 2012. So they were already thinking about things like these 12 years ago. Another thing I think we will have in the rules of law for cyber war is that you have to show who made you. Malware has to have a label, sort of like we've agreed that in the battlefield you're supposed to show your flag. You're not supposed to do what the little green men did in Crimea 8 years ago, and they weren't saying that they were Russian troops. They were breaking international laws when they were waging war without telling who they are fighting for. Exactly the same thing we could do with malware or offensive cyber weapons. They could have, let's say, some kind of a cryptographic block inside, signed with a private key, and either during the conflict or maybe more likely after the conflict, country could show that this piece of malware was our malware. This is what belonged to us, and that would be required by the rules of law for cyber war. I think one day we will have something like that.
Yeah. I thought that we should have a question for the audience that you can answer for us. So the question will be, how many internet service providers does Ukraine have? Is it 2, 12, is it 500, or is it even 5,000? So how many internet service providers does Ukraine have?
So answer in the question chat, and we'll see what the majority says before they get the answer.
Because that is, of course, a relevant question. Like, how can the president of Ukraine still be tweeting? How can they upload pictures on social media and show what is actually going on? You might think that this is the first thing that you might shut down in a country that you go to war with. So how can this be possible? And Mikko, you know the answer to this question.
Yep. Should I tell it now?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm just going to say what the audience thinks. B, D, 12, C, B, C. So there's a lot of different answers.
Right. Well, the right answer is that they have almost 5,000 operators in Ukraine. A country of 44 million people has a massive amount of internet operators. And this is one of the reasons why Ukraine is still online. Even if you do cyber attacks against one operator or 10 operators, you still have thousands of them left. So they have a really distributed mechanism of keeping their internet online. And this is not a coincidence. It's one example on how they've been practically preparing for war for many years. They have wanted to have a very distributed connectivity network. As an end result, they have thousands of operators in a country of 44 million people.
So, and with that said, Speaking about ISP there, what's the importance of Elon Musk's Starlink then?
Starlink is an amazing system. Satellite internet has existed for many years, and historically it was expensive, slow, and had huge latency, which made it impractical for many purposes. It was good for TV broadcasts. Even then there was a visible delay, but not really for internet. And that all changed with SpaceX and Starlink. The main reason why it's so much better is that these satellites are so much lower. They are just a few hundred kilometers above Earth. In fact, you can even see them with spectacles, and that makes them so much better in bandwidth and drop the latency to so low that it's very useful. So yeah, they made a huge difference in Ukraine in locations which were disconnected. Now the combined bandwidth of the 5,000 Starlink antennas they currently have in Ukraine still doesn't make a big difference in the whole outbound bandwidth of the country, but it keeps the isolated places connected with very good connectivity. So it has made a difference. And also, speaking about that, the last 8 years, Ukraine has been building connectivity to Poland, because historically their the fiber optic cables from Ukraine went to north and east to Belarus and Ukraine. They've added massive amounts of capability to connect to west, and right now that is paying back very much.
And I know that Russia, of course, has tried to shut down internet in Ukraine. And I heard that in some places they've taken over the internet routing in occupied areas, and they're forcing them into the Russian information bubbles. So that is kind of the information the Ukrainians are getting. But what has civilians done in the support of Ukraine?
The infrastructure for internet in Ukraine is all run by civilians. It's run by private companies. The biggest operator of these 5,000 is Ukraine Telecom, which is now a privatized company as well. So it's all basically civilians keeping the internet running, and it's running remarkably well. They've lost bandwidth. They have lost roughly 25% of the bandwidth which they used to have before the war 2 months ago. And some areas in Ukraine are offline. For example, Mariupol is offline. It's been offline for quite a while. But for most practical purposes, it's very well still connected 2 months into the war. I've had multiple Zoom and Teams and Google Meet meetings to Kyiv and to Lviv and to other cities in Ukraine, and I'm getting great connectivity, full HD picture, no dropped frames, which is just insane considering that they are in a war. So what explains that? Well, they do have the same kind of connectivity as any other country. They rely on fiber optic cables, and these are getting intercepted and cut and bombed out by the Russians. Isabel, I think you have a couple of photos we can show of what this actually looks like. So in this photo, you see civilians working for local internet operators outside Kyiv, sitting in a bomb crater created by a Russian bomb, which has cut fiber optic cables, and they're fixing the cable. And in the next photo here, a similar scenario, so civilians working for another operator live on the battlefield next to burned out tanks, fixing fiber optic cable, very practically, really risking their lives in order to keep the internet running. People are risking their lives to keep the internet running. This, my friends, this is how important connectivity is during times of war. This is how we see what's happening in Ukraine. They realize that if they are offline, the world doesn't see what's going on in Ukraine, and that's why they are doing what they're doing.
Mikko, we have a question here from the audience. Two questions actually. Number one, should normal Swedish companies, do they need to worry about any kind of cyber war conflict? And two, if so, how should their readiness look like?
You're not going to like my answer. My answer is that yes, you should worry about cyber war. And I'm not alone with this opinion. The situation right now is worrying. 2 months ago, almost 3 months ago, we saw something extraordinary from the United States intelligence. They started putting out very direct communication about how they believed that Russia is planning on invading Ukraine. they saw the situation exactly right. They had the right intelligence, they had access to the right people, and they did the unusual step of disclosing this information and going public with the information, risking blowing their sources going out with this information. But they saw it exactly right, and we just didn't believe them. I didn't believe them. To the very end, I was confident that Putin is not insane enough to attack Ukraine, even though US intelligence tells us that he will. And I was wrong. I think most of us were wrong, and US intelligence had it right. So now, today, when US intelligence, together with CISA, their agency in charge of critical infrastructure protection, is telling the world that they believe Russia will start using more cyber power against the West, we should believe them. We didn't believe them 2 months ago. We should believe them now. And I do believe there will be both revenge attacks to revenge the arms support we, the West, are giving to Ukraine, as well as the sanctions. And then, of course, here in the Nordics, we have the unusual situation of Sweden and Finland jointly joining NATO or applying for NATO membership in the upcoming weeks. And it's quite surprising they haven't already done more to try to shape the opinions of our decision makers and of the civilians and citizens. But yes, we do have to think about this. And what should we do? What would the readiness look like? Well, that's not too different from preparing to any other kind of cyber attacks. Auditing your systems, pen testing your systems, having outsiders try to find weak spots in your defenses, training your people, building visibility, knowing what you have. And when you know what normal situation looks like in your network, then you can start looking for abnormal situations. And the thing about having visibility is that you can't start building it when you're already under attack. You can't build a picture of what normal looks like if you are in an abnormal situation. You have to build it during times when you're not under attack, and that time is right now.
Yeah, and we'll come back because we have some questions from the audience about NATO. But first, I want to take this question. Many experts had expected to see more and more intense cyber attacks against Ukraine. Others claim that there is actually an intense cyber war going on. We just don't see it in the media. What do you think? How intense and effective is the cyber war?
Well, first from Russia to Ukraine, and then let's speak about from the attacks targeting Russia. Russia has failed in both real world and online world. I guess the consensus of the West was that they would have been much more powerful in both. And it's also remarkable how Russia has failed not just in the real world and in cyber attacks, but also to quite extent in information warfare as well. Most of the successful propaganda that we see here in the West is not Russian propaganda, it's Ukrainian propaganda. I'll give you examples of Ukrainian propaganda. President Zelensky answering back to US Air Force willing to evacuate him from Kyiv by saying that I don't need a ride, I need ammo. That's propaganda. My friends, that's what propaganda looks like in 2022. And I like the quote. I like the guy. When I saw this in the beginning of the war, I was like, yeah, hell yeah, that's exactly the way you do it. Like. And then I realized that, I wonder if he actually said that at all, or is it just propaganda? And if he actually did say it for real, I wonder if he came up with it by himself, or was it written by a PR guy? And PR guys during war are propaganda guys. Exactly the same thing with the heroes of the Snake Island, or the stories about the farmers using their tractors to steal Russian tanks. These are all propaganda messages, and they work so well because we agree with this messaging, because we all see Russia aggression against Ukraine. We stand with Ukraine. We want to support Ukraine. It doesn't change the fact that this is propaganda. So practical examples on what Russian attacks on Ukraine, cyber attacks, have achieved. We've seen 5 waves of wiper attacks, destructive attacks from Russian government against Ukrainian infrastructure, including ministries, banks, telecommunications, transportation, and so on. The very first attack during this war started 12 hours before they crossed the border. So on the evening of 23rd of February, they started wiping attacks. They invaded the country 12 hours later on the morning of the 24th. That particular attack had very practical, very real effects. Many of you might remember, you saw news during the first days of the war about massive queues at the Polish border. Ukrainian women and children tried to leave the country and they couldn't get out of Ukraine because border crossings had these kilometer-long queues. The queues were there because the border control computers were wiped by the Russian hermetic wiper attack. This is the reason for the queues. The borders were open. The border controllers were letting people leave, but they just had to do all the paperwork with pen and paper. And that's why it took, in some cases, 36 hours for people to queue to get out of the country. That's a very practical example of what Russian cyber attacks have accomplished. And then when we look to the other direction, what have attacks against Russia accomplished? Quite a bit. There's been now multiple Russian government companies hacked, multiple regulators hacked, multiple oil and gas companies hacked, all of which have had hundreds of gigabytes of information stolen and leaked, and that information is now downloadable online by any of you. Well, what will that cause? Well, one thing it will cause is better sanctions, because right now we're sanctioning where the money goes from companies which are already under sanctioned, and that's hard thing to do, hard to track where the money goes, unless you have access to their internal files and emails, and now we do. We can just read their emails and see where they put the money and then sanction that. So tons of things are happening in the cyber world, things we've never seen before, but I want to make it very clear. I don't want to overemphasize the importance of the cyber attacks in this war. The real war, the real tragedy, the real deaths are happening in the real world. Sure, tons of things are happening in the cyber world right now, but that's not where people die. People die in the real world.
We got another question here as well about the NATO membership. How will our coordination on cyber defense be different if we join NATO?
Finland and Sweden, yeah, Finland and Sweden will have much better access to intelligence information as part of NATO. Both Finland and Sweden do lots of intelligence exchange with NATO countries, but it's still restricted in various different ways, and all those restrictions will be lifted. And this is one of the reasons why NATO wants Finland and Sweden as partners. Sweden has a remarkable intelligence history, remarkable intelligence gathering capability. Finland, with 1,300 kilometers of border with the Russians, of course, we have a long and troubled history with them, and we're able to provide unique insights to NATO, and that will change the way intelligence is being gathered in the military intelligence agencies of Finland and Sweden, and it will also change the way we will be defending our networks. We have much better support from the biggest militaries and cyber operations of these militaries in the world. So it will be a big shift, but it will be the right shift for the better.
And so the other question we have from the audience on the same topic is NATO a big player in cyber defense or cyber offense?
NATO is a big player in both, although we only see examples of NATO cyber offense when things fail. Like if the operations are 100% successful, they will stay invisible and hidden forever. Most of them have done exactly that. That's why cyber operations, offensive operations from NATO countries like Stuxnet, which we know about, we are not supposed to know about them, but they were failures because now they have become public.
And another question then on this, cyber war training is undertaken in countries such as Sweden, Finland, and the US. So surely there must be some sort of result from which will rank countries on their ability. Perhaps it's a secret that stays within the sphere. But yeah. Is there like a ranking on how good a country is on defending themselves?
Yeah, I have a ranking list of sorts in my book. You'll have to buy it to find out.
What a nice cliffhanger.
If you take an example, Mikko, like if you take a country like Estonia, pretty small in population and towards Sweden and Finland, how does a country like Estonia cyber defense readiness compare to us?
Estonia is a special case. Their readiness is very good. They've been taking this problem very seriously as long as they've been independent. They have an even more troubled history with Russia than we do, of course, because they were forced to be part of Russia for all the way until the 1990s. And when they became independent, they were more agile in technology than any other country that I can think of. They had no old legacy. They were able to start rebuilding straight from the internet era. They got independent just when the internet and web started rising. They've always had young and clever leaders to direct their technology map, and that also applies to their military. So it's a small country, but they clearly punch way above their weight in cyber defense.
Yeah. Another question here from the audience. What's your opinion about Kaspersky? Threat or good guys?
Yeah, that's not a question I can answer in a word. I would say both. I know Eugene. I've known Eugene for more than 25 years. I've hung out with him dozens of times. Great technical expert, but also has close connections to Russian government. For example, they are a big customer for Kaspersky. Kaspersky is more than just a Russian company. They have offices and research units around the world. I know many of their researchers, including researchers who are not Russian, who don't live in Russia, who worked for the company for many years. For example, the research they do in Romania is completely world-class, great people. Would I recommend using them in this situation? Of course not. Like, why would you use Russian technology at all? Why would you fund the war directly or indirectly? Of course, I'm not recommending it, but that's not because the technology would be bad or the researchers wouldn't be good. The technology is good, the researchers are good. And even in peacetime, even before this war, I wouldn't have recommended Russian software solutions for critical infrastructure or enterprise-sized companies. For home users or small medium companies, sure, they're not being targeted by foreign governments or intelligence agencies, but it is a complicated situation, and it is a pity. It is really a pity because it's one of the very, very few technology success stories out of Russia. And this is really surprising. Russia is the biggest country on the planet. They have dozens of world-class technical universities, great researchers, some of the best programmers in the world. Russian technology people have started some of the most important companies on the planet in the West. 50% of the founders of Google are Russian, for example, because Sergey Brin is Russian and Larry Page is American, so 50%. But it's really hard to name Russian technology success stories. Kaspersky is a rare exception. Can you name Russian mobile phone manufacturers or Russian laptop makers? No, you can't. You can name tons of Chinese companies which build phones or laptops, but you can't name a single Russian one. And that's really weird, isn't it? But then again, in this situation, it's our benefit. It's actually very easy for us here in the West to avoid using Russian products. Imagine if we would have to try to avoid Chinese products. That would be impossible. But Russia, for different reasons, haven't been exporting their technology.
Yeah. Should take a question to the audience, actually. Thought of doing that. So there is only one WithSecure. There's only one Mikko Hyppönen, of course. But how many cybersecurity vendors exist only that is coming from the US? You can answer in the chat or in the question box. So is it 350? Is it 3,500 or is it 12,000? That is coming from there. Big numbers, big country, of course. Side note on that, actually, WithSecure is by far the largest cybersecurity vendor that is coming out of the Nordics. Actually, one of the absolute largest, I would say, even in Europe. both in terms of revenue and in terms of employees. So the right number of this is actually 3,500-ish, something like that. So that's how many cybersecurity vendors that's only coming out from the US. And as a side note on that, if you take a country like Israel, more or less the same kind of population as Sweden, they have around 500 coming out of there. And I think we in Sweden, we have about 8 in different sizes. So, but when point on this is that when you read in the news all the time, Mikko, there's always, the American examples of attacks. Like this cyber attack happened in the US, this attack happened to critical infrastructure in the US. But what does the cyber threat landscape actually look like for us here in the Nordics?
What the internet did is that it took away geography, it took away borders. There are no distances anymore, and that's great when you want to do international business, and it's bad when you have to worry about risk and crime. Crime used to be local. Now crime is global. The criminals who couldn't reach us before the internet can now easily reach us regardless of where they are and where we are. So in that sense, we are not in the Nordics. We are on the internet. We are as close to the enemy as anyone else. The only things protecting us is our own defenses, and in some attacks, our small language areas. So for example, phishing attacks in Sweden only are really successful på svenska. Same thing in Finland and so on. So there's some protection we get from the language, but the best protection we get is by building our own defenses. And the Nordics are among the best in the world in building our defenses, because the overall technical know-how level of the average citizen and the average company are pretty high. And most importantly, our technology is up to date. We're running recent hardware with up-to-date operating systems, which are still patchable and updatable. For example, again, Ukraine. Ukraine is a big country, 44 million people. Their GDP is 1/5 of Finland. It's a poor country, and that clearly shows in the hardware they run. For example, there's still tons of Windows 7 in use in the machines they run, because they can't run Windows 10 because the machines are too old. And Windows 7 is out of support. You don't get patches anymore. It's really hard to defend your network when you are running out of date operating systems. So the Nordics are in better shape than most of the world. And of course, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't still have a lot of work to do, because we do.
How do you think the threat landscape will evolve now in the next coming, let's say, 3 years?
It's going to get worse. I'm sorry to say. I think we've only seen the very beginning of these problems. And it's remarkable that with all the defenses we're building, the attackers are capable of finding ways around them. So this is a never-ending arms race, or a game of cat and mouse, where whatever defenses we build, whatever a man can build, a man can undo. It's sort of like trying to build an unpickable lock. Even if you put the best expert in the world to build a lock which is very hard to pick, it's still not unpickable. If the attackers who want to pick the lock just have a lot of time and a lot of resources, they will find a way to pick it. And this is the scenario we are facing. The cyber landscape most likely will not look better in 3 years. It's going to look worse.
And we have a questions here from the audience. What are the most likely targets in Sweden and Suomi? Financial sector, pension funds, OT, energy and transport sector.
They are either highly visible symbolic targets, or they are targets which have a practical thing against the everyday lives of the citizens. We've seen denial of service attacks against symbolic targets in the Nordics. A good example are the attacks against the Finnish website of the Defense Ministry, which was attacked with denial of service attacks right at the moment when President Zelensky was addressing the Finnish parliament. He did that roughly a week after he spoke to the Swedish parliament. And clearly that's a website which has no importance to anyone. Like, how often do you visit the website of the Defense Ministry? Well, never. But it's a very, very symbolic attack. Like, oh my God, our Defense Ministry was attacked. So it feels bad. And that's all it does. It feels bad, but it has no practical importance. We're going to see attacks like that. Then we might see attacks against infrastructure which really makes a difference in our lives. And we've already seen attacks against bank networks. When you can't pay your bills, or when you can't use your credit card or bank card, that's a very practical attack. And we've seen that. We might see more of that. And then we might see attacks against energy systems. And we've already seen that. Conti, one of the Russian ransomware gangs, which has pledged allegiance to Russian government during this war, attacked the second largest windmill or wind farm operator in Germany 3 weeks ago. And that's not a coincidence. Europe, especially Germany, tries to get rid of Russian oil, gas, and coal, and the best way to do that is with atom energy, but Germans don't like atom energy for some reason, so they are counting on renewables like wind energy. So Russian cybercrime gangs working in tandem with the Russian government attacking power generation in Germany is a direct attack on where it counts. And then it has the added benefit for Russia that this was a ransomware attack. They were asking for payments from this company in Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is unsanctionable. Bitcoin, unlike rubles or euros or dollars, is based on math. Real world currencies are not based on math. They're based on politics. And if something is based on politics, you can sanction it. When something is based on math, you can't regulate it. You can't sanction it. Math ignores regulations. It's sort of like trying to pass a law which would change the value of p. Math would ignore whatever you would try to regulate.
I just wanted to say a quick note, because I know that we're now running over time and we have some questions left from the audience, and we will be recording this and sending it out to everyone that has signed up. So if you need to jump out, we'll send you the recording today or tomorrow. So no need to be sad that you're missing the Q&A part with you, Mikko. But let's go through these questions. What cyber gangs or cyber criminals would you say is the most dangerous and most capable at the moment?
It's the biggest Russian ransomware gangs and the biggest African BEC gangs that I would name here. We've been following the growth of what I call cybercrime unicorns for 5 years now. Unicorn here is reference to the unicorn startups, billion-dollar sized startup companies. We have the equivalent of those in the cybercrime world as well. And it really split quite clearly that, you know, the ransomware operators are coming from ex-Soviet states, and then the BEC operators, the CEO scammers, are coming from Africa. Both of them are becoming more and more wealthy. And when these gangs become wealthy, they can afford to invest into their attacks. So, for example, the Karbanak gang operating from Moscow has now run multiple fake front companies, which are recruiting pen testers, apparently for legal companies to do remote work for pen testing into companies, which is all fake. These front companies don't really exist, and the pen testers that they recruit end up working for a Russian cybercrime gang. Lockbit, Trickbot, and Conti are examples of the biggest ransomware gangs, and they're also example of the gangs who have taken a stand during this war. So they are either cooperating directly or indirectly with the Russian government.
That is actually another question from the audience. Like, how do cyber criminals actually recruit other cyber criminals?
They do that. Well, the example I gave is a little bit of an exception. So we knew, for example, Combine Security was one of these fake front-end companies that Karbanak gang was doing to recruit people to work for them. Although in that case, some of the people they recruited didn't realize that they're working for criminals, because it looked like a real company and they were paying real salaries. Much more typical is that they openly recruit other criminals or affiliates to join their operations. For example, Conti had around 200 or has around 200 people working for them. They pay salaries twice a month. They have HR people. They have their own IT support, their own data centers. They have lawyers working for them, like real world, like traditional mafia kind of organization. And recruitment happens on Tor Hidden Service and related chats and forums where these guys discuss.
And we have some questions about Anonymous. What is Anonymous classified as if not a terrorist organization? And then the other question is, I kind of like Anonymous for their official message to Putin. Should I be worried about liking them? Can people like them be our new kind of heroes, or is it the darkest nightmare?
Yes, Anonymous is not a terror organization, but of course there are similarities. They are not a criminal organization either, and that's the similarity. Like when you break the laws, but you don't break the laws to get a benefit for yourself, but you break the law for ideological reasons. That's the similarity. Another similarity between like hacktivist gangs like Anonymous and terrorist groups is that it's mostly like a brand than anything else. If we think about ISIS or ISIL or Al Qaeda, they are brands. Anybody can claim to be part of them and do attacks under their brand. Exactly the same thing with Anonymous. There is no organization called Anonymous. Anybody can be part of Anonymous. You just take the brand and do attacks under the brand. But that doesn't mean that these hacktivist gangs would be terrorists. They're not. Most of them are very young ideological hobbyists who want to make a difference, who believe in their mission, who want to use their skills to make a difference somehow, and they choose to break the law while they do that.
Yeah. Do you think we've seen a peak of cyber attacks against targets in Ukraine? And my add-on to that question is, do you think we'll now instead see a peak towards NATO countries or Sweden or Finland if we join NATO? What do you think?
That's hard to estimate. I'm not gonna make a guess on that. There's no easy way to know. I'm surprised that we haven't seen more from Russia, and I think we will see more. Whether that's going to be targeting Ukraine or the rest of the world, we'll see.
And then another question, I don't know if you know this, but did you know that a Swedish bank, Swedbank, got hacked? Or we don't know if they're hacked, but they closed down the other day, and everyone who had accounts there couldn't get a hold of their money. Have you read about that?
Yep. Yes, I read about it. Yeah, and it's a great example on how money has become data.
Yeah.
Data is money, and money is data. Now, it's natural to worry about your own savings situations like that. However, the Nordic banks are safe. Your monies are safe in the banks. I'm not recommending people to pick up their life savings in cash and put it under the mattress. That's even worse. It's not, even if the bank you use gets hacked, you're not going to lose your money. Banks have and governments have coverage systems in the Nordics, and our money is safe even in unusual situations. However, it is a good idea to have credit cards or bank cards in multiple different banks. Even if you only really use one bank, then to have a backup card which you can use if your own normal card doesn't work is obviously a good idea, and I do recommend that to everyone.
Yeah. And do you think that it was Russia who hacked them? That's a part of the question.
That's a good question. What's the next question?
Can you share some light on how WithSecure actually collects your threat intelligence? Obviously, you get some intelligence from your customer, but what else are you doing?
Well, we run a very extensive network of honeypots and honeynets. So there's tons of machines on the internet right now which look like vulnerable home computers or exposed company networks or enterprise networks or factories, and all of that is fake. None of that is real. It's all bait systems and honeynets that we run to try to trap attackers to gain access to these networks so we can monitor how they do it, and once they get in, what they do inside. So what we're effectively trying to do is to get hacked ourselves before our customers get hacked, so we can then defend real customers against real attacks. Or we want to get infected by new malware before our customers get infected by the same malware. And to do that, we run extensive networks of sensors, honeypots, and honeynets. And then we add on all that intelligence with real world cases that we work with our clients and enterprises, and that our incident responders are resolving. when all that is combined, we have a very good picture of what's happening on the internet at any given time.
So maybe as a last one here before we wrap up, there's always, of course, a lot of negativity about cybersecurity, you know, hackers and cyber warfare. Do you have any sunshine stories to share?
I've spent my life working in security, and we security guys have a bad reputation. The reputation is that they are the guys and girls who always say no. Like, whatever you want, security people tell you you can't do it. No, you can't install that software. No, you can't have the admin rights. No, you can't open that port. No, you can't buy that device. That's the wrong way of looking at this, because in effect, security is the part of the organization which enables the rest of the organization to work. Security is the enabler. It's the part that needs to be there for the rest of the organization to be productive and creative. And when security works, when we get the sunshine stories, they never make the news. You see, when the security department deploys a new security system which prevented an attack, or when the IT department worked overnight to patch all the workstations against the new vulnerability, just in time to prevent a breach which would have happened in the morning, whenever that happens, the end result is that nothing happens. And I can guarantee to you that there will not be a headline in tomorrow's newspaper saying that the second largest company in Sweden was not hacked yesterday, because that's not news. When companies don't get hacked, that's not news. When companies do get hacked, then it is front page news. So we only hear the bad news. We never hear about the good news. And believe me when I say there's much more success stories in security than failures, but we only hear about the failures.
Definitely. Maybe we should take a separate webinar only talk about all our success stories with our customers, actually. Absolute last one, Mikko, before we finish here. Pegasus has been flying around, got a lot of attention, attacking iPhones, etc. What can we tell about that?
Sorry, I lost you for a second. Please repeat.
Pegasus, the mobile malware.
Yep.
For those that don't know, for instance, what can we tell about that?
Pegasus, in a sentence, is a private, very expensive mobile malware sold for governments so they can use it to do intelligence gathering for their intelligence agencies. It's unique because it's able to break into our iPhones, and our iPhones and iPads are among the most secure everyday devices we can use. It can also target Android devices and even laptops, but it's mostly used against iPhones because it's very hard to gain access to iPhones any other way. So it seems scary. I guess big part of us are running iPhones or iPads. However, you're not a target for Pegasus. If it's not worth hundreds of thousands of euros for a government to gain access to your iPhone, then you will not be targeted, because that's how expensive it is. So we saw, for example, last week that the Prime Minister of Spain was targeted with Pegasus. Well, his iPhone is worth hundreds of thousands of euros for multiple governments to gain intelligence about what he's doing, but he's not normal. Like, you and I will not be targeted by Pegasus.
Awesome. So with that said, thank you so much for today, Mikko. Thank you everyone for listening in. Thank you so much for all of your questions. Don't forget to follow Mikko on Twitter. If you want to get in contact with us at WithSecure, please do so. Follow us, for instance, on LinkedIn, where we post a lot of news. You have our contact details here on the screen as well. And see you next time. We're going to have another special guest then. Stay tuned for that. And thank you so much, and have a lovely day, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.